The subway station was noisy as always, and he was just an old man trying to make a few coins.
Until he started to play that piece.
A lost sonata with 13 impossible chords that no one had heard in 40 years. The entire station went quiet for a moment, but in the crowd, a world-famous conductor froze. He knew that music.
Only one person could play it, and that person was supposed to be dead. His name was Antonio.
In his 70s, his shoulders slumped with the weight of life, his face a map of deep lines that softened once sharp features. The old overcoat he wore had seen countless winters. The worn-out violin case open in front of him held a brutal accounting of his day's labor, a few dollar bills and a handful of coins. The violin in his hand was not a master's creation, but a weary instrument rescued from the dusty shelf of a pawn shop. Its strings were old, its varnish chipped in places. To this crowd, Antonio was invisible, a part of the city's decor, an ignored whisper. With his eyes closed, he slowly drew his bow across the strings, playing simple, familiar melodies that wouldn't drown out the noise of the crowd, but merely accompany it. For a few minutes, everything was as usual. The screech of the trains, the muffled sound of announcements, and the endless hum of people swallowed Antonio's music. Then something changed. Antonio finished the simple folk song he had been playing. He paused for a moment, took a deep breath. When he opened his eyes, his gaze was no longer empty and tired. In them, the embers of an old fire glowed. And then he began to play the impossible sonata. The first note cut through the noisy atmosphere of the station like a scalpel. It was unlike anything he had played before. It was a complex, audacious, and dangerous melody. It felt as if a storm was approaching. The notes were like bolts of lightning chasing one another. His fingers began to dance on the neck of the violin with incredible speed and precision. The bow, like a sword, tore a piece from the soul of the listener with every stroke. This was music that spoke in a forgotten language. It contained both a noble sorrow and an untamable fury. This was the lost sonata. The first to notice were those standing closest. A few youths looking at their phones raised their heads. A businessman rushing by slowed his pace. The structure of the music was outside the familiar patterns of the human brain. It was a work that navigated the border of genius and madness, containing 13 impossible chords. As the melody soared, its sphere of influence expanded. People passing through the turnstiles paused. Those descending the stairs stopped on the steps. Slowly, the deafening noise of the station subsided. It was replaced by a hypnotic silence created by the incredible music pouring from a single violin. The people were no longer a crowd, but an audience. It was at that moment that Maestro Julian Thorne, rushing through the crowd to make his rehearsal at Carnegie Hall, was at the other end of the station. In his $1,000 overcoat and with his custom-made leather bag, he seemed like an anomaly in this grimy environment. He was young, successful, and a little jaded. He was living the bright but exhausting life that fame brings. His expensive headphones isolated him from the city's noise. He hadn't even noticed the street musician in the corner. Just as he was taking his final steps towards the train, he paused for a moment. Those notes had managed to seep through even the best noise-cancelling technology. At first, he dismissed it. But then the second the third note came, Thorne remained rooted to the spot. He slowly took off his headphones. What he was hearing was impossible. This was not a melody. It was one of the greatest legends in music history. The piece that old professors at the Vienna Conservatory whispered about, a work whose sheet music was not even known to exist, said to be playable only by the genius Maestro Vianello. Thorne thought it was a joke, maybe a hidden camera prank. But then he heard the technique. That unique vibrato, that impossible finger position of the left hand. These could not be imitated. They were a musician's fingerprint, and this fingerprint belonged to Antonio Vianello, who had disappeared 40 years ago. Thorne's heart was pounding in his chest. He was breathless. The people around him thought they were listening to beautiful music, but Thorne knew he was witnessing a miracle. This was equivalent to a rare flower blooming on the summit of Everest, or the discovery of a new life form at the bottom of the ocean. He scanned the crowd and found the source of the sound. The sight he saw was even more shocking than the music he heard. The genius, who should have been under the bright lights of a stage, was an old, exhausted man leaning against the dirty wall of a subway station, playing for a few dollars in his worn-out case. The sonata reached its crescendo. The notes poured down like a waterfall, echoing in the dome of the station, piercing the hearts of the listeners. This was not just a technical achievement. It was the transformation of a lifetime of pain, anger, and regret into sound. This was a declaration of war. And then the final note came, a heartbreaking, single and clear note, like Gabriel's horn. It hung in the air, vibrated, and slowly melted into the silence.
A moment. For just one moment, the entire station held its breath.
They were under a spell. Then, the whistle of a train broke the silence. The spell was broken. People came to their senses, looking around as if waking from a dream. Some applauded. Many, more generous than usual, dropped bills into the old man's case. And then, the ruthless rhythm of life returned. The rushing, the pushing and shoving, it all continued. The miracle was over. But not for Julian Thorne. He was still standing there, unable to move. He couldn't take his eyes off the old man. Antonio, as if he were not the person who had just rewritten music history, was moving slowly and methodically. He cleaned his bow, carefully placed his violin inside its cheap case. He pocketed the money from the case without counting it. Every movement was slow, calm, and ordinary. There was no trace left of the divine storm he had just created. Thorne wanted to take a step towards him, but he didn't know what to say. What could one say? "You are a living legend? We thought you were dead."
How did you play that piece?
All words seemed meaningless, all questions irrelevant. Antonio closed his violin case, raised the collar of his overcoat, and as if nothing had happened, began to slowly disappear into the anonymous flood of people leaving the station. Left behind was a maestro in shock, questioning whether what he had heard was real, and the faint echoes of an impossible sonata lingering in the cool air of the subway station. Julian Thorne followed the old man to the subway exit. As the city's noise once again descended upon them, Antonio walked with ordinary, tired steps into the crowd, as if he had never created the miracle just moments before. Thorne finally caught up with him, his voice gentle but insistent. "Sir, please wait." Antonio stopped and turned to him. The expression on his face was completely devoid of the divine glow it held while playing the violin. Now he was just a weary, grumpy old man. "If you're giving a buck, give it, son."
If you're wasting my time, get out of my way. Thorne was taken aback. No, not money.
"The piece you just played."
That was no folk song. That was... Antonio cut him off, his voice like a whip.
"It was noise to get a few dollars. Now leave me alone." He tried to walk away again. Thorne, feeling the opportunity of a lifetime slipping through his fingers, panicked.
No, it wasn't noise.
It was the Sonata of Embers, Vianello's lost work.
It doesn't even have sheet music. I have to know how you know it.
At the mention of the name Vianello, Antonio's face went pale for a second. It was possible to see something shudder behind a 40-year-old wall in his eyes, but he quickly composed himself.
I don't know those names, he grumbled.
"Just an old tune." And he began to walk away with determined steps. Thorne was desperate. He couldn't let this man, this legend, disappear into the shadows again. He had to play the last, most dangerous card he had. He shouted after him, his voice clear enough to cut through the noise of the crowd. "Dmitri Volkov!"
Antonio froze on the spot as if an invisible knife had been plunged into his back.
His shoulders tensed. The sounds of the rainy New York street, the car horns, the sirens, they all faded away, muffled. All that remained was the cruel echo of that name, the name of the rival he had kept locked in the darkest corner of his mind. When he closed his eyes, he was no longer in New York. It was Moscow, 1980s. The magnificent gilded hall of the Tchaikovsky competition was crackling with tension. This was the cultural front of the Cold War, and the stage was set for the final duel between two young titans. On one side, there was Dmitry Volkov, the darling of the Soviet Union, a man of icy perfectionism. Volkov was not a musician. He was a surgeon.
Every note was flawless, every movement calculated.
His violin was an instrument to display his mathematical genius, not his emotions. The audience admired him, the jury worshipped his technique. On the other side was the 22-year-old genius Antonio Vianello, burning with Italian fire. He was arrogant, passionate, and dangerously talented. If music was a science for Volkov, for Vianello it was a war. His violin was his weapon, his notes, his bullets. He penetrated the soul of the audience, making them cry, laugh, leaving them breathless. The jury was both impressed and frightened by his uncontrolled genius. Throughout the competition, these two opposite poles had consumed each other. Vianello had responded to Volkov's flawless technique with his passionate interpretation. This was not just a music competition. It was a clash of two different philosophies. Would cold, perfect logic win, or the flawed but blazing soul? The final night had arrived. Volkov had once again delivered a superhuman performance. He played like a machine without a single false note and left the stage. The applause in the hall was respectful but distant. Now it was Vianello's turn. Backstage, his teacher was begging him, "Antonio, don't take risks. Play a known piece to impress the jury. Play Brahms, play Paganini." But Vianello's eyes were shining like fire. "No," he said, "history will be written tonight. Tonight, I will prove that that machine has no soul." From his bag, he took out the piece that no one knew, the piece he had been secretly working on for months. Sonata of Embers. It was his secret weapon, the impossible piece he had composed to shatter Volkov's cold perfectionism. This was his final gambit. When he took the stage, a deep silence fell over the hall. He placed his violin under his chin and began. From the very first note, everyone understood that this was unlike anything they had ever heard. This was a duel. Vianello's fingers, as if on fire, were moving on the violin. The melody was a vortex that captured the soul of the listener. The audience leaned forward in their seats, holding their breath. This was not just music. It was a man pouring out his soul, all his anger, his passion, and his arrogance. He had reached the most difficult, the most complex part of the piece. The dizzying passage with 13 chords that even Volkov would not dare to play.
His fingers were flying.
Everything was perfect. He could feel the victory. And at that very moment, at that peak, his little finger slipped by 1,000th of a millimeter.
A ghost note.
A tiny mistake that perhaps only he, the jury, and Volkov, who was listening to him backstage, heard among the thousands in the hall. But for Vianello, this was the end of his world. That tiny crack in the armor of perfection was a fatal wound for him. When he finished the piece, the hall erupted in applause. People were crying, shouting, "Bravo!" But Vianello didn't hear the audience. His eyes were on the wings, and there, standing in the shadows, he saw the tiny, almost imperceptible, triumphant smile on Dmitry Volkov's face. In that moment, everything was over. Volkov won the competition. Officially, Vianello was second, still a star. But in his own mind, he had lost that war. The ambition of the music world, its politics, the cold calculations of the jury, and the obsession with winning disgusted him. Art had turned into a competition, a sport, and he had lost in this dirty game. At the award ceremony, he refused to accept the second-place medal. Without a word, he walked out of that magnificent concert hall and disappeared into the snow-covered streets of Moscow. Everyone thought he was acting out of a momentary anger that he would return the next day. But he did not. Antonio Vianello that night, leaving even his priceless violin behind, disappeared as if he had never existed. When he opened his eyes on the rainy New York street, his face was contorted with old pain and unquenched anger. He had seen that moment in his dreams every night for 40 years. Julian Thorne, in the silence of this broken man standing before him, understood the whole story. "That world," whispered Antonio, his voice hoarse with the rust of years, "is not about music. It's a battlefield of egos."
And I lost the only battle that mattered.
"So I left the war?" Thorn swallowed. "Why now?" he asked, his voice full of curiosity and respect.
After 40 years, why did you play that piece in a subway station?
Antonio looked up at the sky, ignoring the raindrops hitting his face. "Today," he said, "is the anniversary of his victory." He paused, a bitter smile on his face. "I suppose I wanted to see if that old score was truly settled, to see if the music, without judges or applause, still had a soul." Then he turned and began to walk away, limping. Julian Thorn didn't stop him. He just watched as a living legend, a king who had exiled himself after the last battle he had won, disappeared again into the indifferent crowd of the city. For 2 days after that night, Julian Thorn waited at that subway station. He was chasing a legend, the shadow of a living history. Finally, on the evening of the 3rd day, he found Antonio leaning against the same wall, tuning his violin. He sat next to him and, after a moment of silence, said, "I can't give you back the 40 years the world stole from you, but I can give your music back to the world.
I can book Carnegie Hall for you.
I can bring the Vienna Philharmonic to your feet. You just have to say the word." Antonio finished tuning, resined his bow, and spoke without looking at Thorn. "That world is a golden cage, son." "I prefer freedom in the dirt," Thorn insisted. "You can't let this genius be wasted for a few coins in a subway station. It's a crime against music." A bitter smile appeared on Antonio's face. "The real crime is turning music into a competition, a duel of ambitions."
I committed that crime once. I will not commit it again. He was determined.
The warrior was refusing to return to the battlefield. Thorn left the station that day with the weight of the greatest living musician's refusal. He understood that Antonio would not return, but he couldn't let his music die either. Thorn's plan began to take shape weeks later. In the corridors of Juilliard, he was watching a young violinist who worked with an obsessive perfectionism, Ilara. Ilara was technically flawless. Her fingers worked like a machine, playing even the most difficult pieces without a single mistake. Her idol was Dmitri Volkov. She was trying to achieve a cold, flawless perfection devoid of emotion, just like him. But her music, no matter how perfect, was soulless. Thorn had found the person he was looking for. He approached Ilara and told her about the legendary Vianello-Volkov duel.
Everyone thinks Volkov's perfection is the peak, he said.
But what if there was more?
Something played with fire, with soul.
Thorn played her the poor-quality recording he had secretly made in the subway that day. The notes that seeped through the noise and static were unlike anything Ilara had ever heard. It was technically impossible, but at the same time it was alive. It was breathing. Ilara was mesmerized by this nameless sound, this legendary melody. For weeks, she listened to that recording, trying to transcribe the notes, to decipher that impossible technique. She could play the notes, yes, but she couldn't capture the soul. Her music remained just a cold imitation of Antonio's. Frustrated, she decided to throw herself into the outside world. Perhaps playing among the people would help her find that missing emotion. And with Thorn's subtle guidance, she found herself one afternoon in the same subway station where Antonio always was. She closed her eyes and began to play the Sonata of Embers. At the other end of the station, Antonio froze when he heard those first notes. He was listening to a piece of his own soul, his own secret language, pouring from the fingers of a stranger. But this was not his language. It was like someone speaking his words but not knowing their meaning. Ilara was playing like Volkov. The notes were correct, but the story was wrong.
Antonio couldn't bear to watch.
The old warrior within him could not let his rival's philosophy, that cold and soulless technique, conquer his masterpiece. He slowly got up and walked towards the girl. When Ilara finished the piece, she looked at the old, tired man standing in front of her. "You are playing the notes, not the music," said Antonio, his voice harsh and critical. "Your violin is a tool, not a voice. You don't hear the anger." Ilara was surprised.
Anger? This piece is sorrowful? No, said Antonio.
This piece was written with anger towards a man, with a rebellion against the arrogance of perfection. Without feeling that anger, you are just scraping the strings. He took the violin from Ilara's hand. He didn't say who he was, he didn't give his name. He just corrected her hand holding the bow. "Breathe," he whispered. "And remember, the most powerful sound comes not from the most flawless, but from the most honest." And then he played just a single passage of the sonata, that most complex part, just 30 seconds. But in those 30 seconds, Ilara learned again what music meant. The notes that poured from Antonio's fingers were not just sounds, they were flames. The soul that Ilara had been trying to imitate for weeks was now standing before her, alive and breathing. Antonio handed the violin back and turned and left without a word. Ilara stared after him. She had just received a lesson from the Master of Masters without even knowing who he was. Months later, a grand memorial concert was being held in New York's most prestigious concert hall in honor of Dmitri Volkov. The star of the night was the young violinist Ilara, who had drawn all attention to herself with her incredible rise in recent months. She was expected to play Volkov's most famous concerto on the program. Backstage, Ilara was nervous. Thorn was there to support her. And at that very moment, from the shadows, that familiar silhouette that seemed not to belong here appeared. Antonio. He was wearing that same old overcoat. He slowly approached Ilara. He didn't wish her luck. He spoke like a commander giving his soldier her final order. "Don't honor him," he said, his voice determined. "Defeat him. Don't let his legacy win tonight." He handed a yellowed old sheet of music into Ilara's trembling hands. It was the original handwritten score of the Sonata of Embers. "Show them what real music is," whispered Antonio, and disappeared into the shadows as silently as he had come. When Ilara took the stage, the entire hall gave her a standing ovation. She turned to the conductor and announced a change in the program. A deep silence fell over the hall. And then Ilara began to play. That first note tore through a 40-year silence. This was not the angry performance in the subway station. This was a flawless storm that combined the anger of a master and the soul of a student. Ilara was not just playing the notes. She was telling a story, the birth of a genius, the challenge of a rival, the devastation brought by a mistake, and a rebellion reborn from the ashes. The music was technically as flawless as Volkov's, but at the same time as passionate as Vianello's. The hall was holding its breath, witnessing this historic moment. When the piece ended, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the hall literally exploded. Applause, screams, tears. But an old music critic sitting in the back rows stood up. He was a young journalist who had watched that legendary duel in Moscow 40 years ago. With tears streaming down his face, he shouted in a voice that everyone could hear, "Vianello!" The name spread through the hall like a shockwave. The legend was back.
A few days later, Antonio was in a subway station again.
But this time he was not playing. He was just sitting on a bench listening to another young, enthusiastic musician. He picked up a discarded newspaper next to him. The headline on the arts page caught his eye. "The Forgotten Master, Vianello's Legacy, defeats Volkov after 40 years. A small, bitter but satisfied smile appeared on the old man's face. He slowly folded the newspaper and left it on the bench where he had been sitting. He stood up and walked towards the anonymous crowd of the city. The warrior had won his final battle. He could finally rest in peace. Have you ever met someone like Antonio? Someone who seemed ordinary but had an extraordinary past? Share your experiences in the comments. And if this story touched you, subscribe to help keep such stories alive.